This is the Polygon Bend R9X, an aluminum framed gravel bike with a pretty high-end spec of components, and that alone makes the R9X a bit of an outliner in the gravel world. Now, the fate of a unique bike like this usually goes one of two ways. Either it gains a cult following and soon after many imitators from other brands, or it dies a slow, oftentimes very price-reduced death. I've been riding this bike now for a couple months, and I'm excited to tell you everything I've learned along the way, and I'll let you make the decision as to which way you think the Bend will go. Before I get started though, take a quick second to like this video, as that'll help other people find it. Now, on to the bike, and let's get started with the frame, because this really is the thing that makes the Bend line of bikes stand out from a lot of other gravel bikes on the market, for better and in some cases for worse. On all accounts, the Bend leans far into the up-for-anything mountain bike-inspired side of the gravel spectrum. At the front of the bike, it has a seriously slack 70.5-degree head tube angle. It also has an equally steep 75.5-degree seat tube angle and long 440mm chainstays. This puts the wheelbase on my size large at 1,078mm, which is on the long side of the spectrum. I found that this made the bike surprisingly stable and planted on fast descents without feeling overly lethargic or cumbersome at lower speeds. The long rear end I talked about a second ago is paired with a pretty dang short reach. It's actually just 396mm on this size large, and that's combined with a pretty tall 621mm stack. This gives the bike a very upright riding position, which I, as a mountain biker, enjoyed. But riders looking for the fastest, most efficient bike should probably look elsewhere. All in all, I think that Bend's geometry is perfect for riders who are looking to push their gravel bike far beyond what you'd usually expect to do on a typical drop bar setup. And I think Polygon's decision to build this frame out of aluminum speaks to that as well. This was my first time riding an alloy gravel bike, and I have to say I was cautiously optimistic that those drop seat stays as well as the slim tubing used in the rear triangle would make for more of a compliant ride than I would usually expect from an aluminum frame. Sadly, however, this wasn't the case. Even with the generous 44mm tires set up tubeless at 35 psi in the front and 40 in the back, it was still a jarring experience, especially on washboard fire roads. This was more noticeable on the rear of the bike, as the carbon fork and padded bar tape managed to keep the ride relatively comfortable up front. To remedy this, I would be interested to try running an insert, at least in the back of the bike, as I think that would help dampen some of those vibrations and allow me to run lower PSI without worrying about a puncture. Speaking of tires though, the Bend frame is mudguard compatible and has clearance for a claimed tire width of 50mm, but after looking at the spacing in there, I wouldn't be surprised if you could fit a 57mm tire or even a 29 by 2¼ inch. One last highlight of the Bend's frame set that I sadly didn't get to utilize while testing is the whopping 16 mounting points between the frame and fork. This makes it a great contender for those looking to use it as a touring or bikepacking bike. Next up, let's talk about the part spec that comes on the R9X, which is the middle tier option of the Polygon Bend and usually lists for $2,999, but is currently on sale in the US for just $2,799. As you probably noticed by now, a big highlight of the spec is the wireless shifting and dropper post. The SRAM Rival Access group set performed flawlessly while testing. This was my first time riding SRAM's mid-tier group set on a gravel bike, and I was consistently impressed by how crisp and quick the shifts were, even under load. My only complaint was the relatively narrow 10 to 44 tooth cassette that, paired with a single 40 tooth chainring, left me wanting a bit more gear range, specifically on the steeper climbs. The top tier Bend V9X does come with a SRAM GX cassette that has a 10 to 52 tooth range, and if I were to own this bike, that would be an upgrade that I'd make pretty early on. One thing I would not upgrade, however, are the brakes. I was really impressed with these SRAM Rival brakes, and paired to the 160mm Paceline rotors, they were more than enough for my needs, and I never noticed any fade even on long fire road descents. Moving on then to the dropper post, and while I am a huge fan of dropper posts on gravel bikes, the Bend's low seat tube really did deserve more than the 75mm of drop that were made available by this RockShox Reverb Access post. Now, it's worth noting that at 6'1", I am on the taller size of the recommended sizing for a size large frame, but taller riders or those with longer legs should definitely consider sizing up, or at least planning on replacing the dropper seat post pretty early on. But don't worry, because it's not all doom and gloom for the R9X. I actually loved the short 45mm stem that the bike came spec'd with. This made the handling characteristics of the bike much more akin to what I'm used to, which is something I think many mountain bikers will appreciate. And it was more of the same with the Entity Expert flared gravel bars. I found the 16-degree flare and 440mm width that came with my size large to be pretty spot on. One surprising and very exciting spec choice on this bike was the choice to include carbon fiber Novatec G24 disc wheels. This wheel set alone lists for $1,100, over a third of the cost of the bike, and plays a large part in keeping the weight of my size large at a respectable 22.7 pounds. And that's set up tubeless without pedals. These hookless rims have an unremarkable width of 24mm and a depth of 28mm. And I have to say that any kind of vibration damping that their carbon layup was meant to provide got mostly washed away with the relative stiffness of the frame. Like I mentioned earlier, the R9X comes with 44mm tires, more specifically a pair of V-Tire Co. Rocketman tires. They feature a relatively aggressive dual compound tread as well as armored sidewalls to help prevent punctures. And I have to say that I was regularly impressed by just how much grip they provided in variable trail conditions. This was of course at the cost of being not quite as fast rolling as other more traditional gravel tires that I've spent time on. Best yet though is that despite pushing this bike a bit harder than it probably was designed to, I never had a puncture, and for that I am very thankful. Going into this review, I was very optimistic about the Polygon Bend R9X. As a mountain biker, I was stoked on the aggressive aluminum frame paired with a pretty dialed set of parts. And while I did genuinely enjoy the frame set, my lasting impression of the bike sadly came down to some of the quirks associated with those very parts. At a minimum, I would need to replace the dropper post in order to get full extension while pedaling, as well as make the most of the low slung frame. And speaking of pedaling, I'd probably want to upgrade that cassette pretty early on as well. And that's a lot of money to add on top of a bike that already costs close to $3,000. Instead of the R9X then, I would probably spend my hard-earned cash on the Bend's least expensive sibling, the R7, which at the time of filming you can pick up for just $1,299. This bike features the same frame and fork, but gets a mechanical 11-speed Apex drivetrain, mechanical dropper post, and alloy wheels. So sure, you'd lose the weight savings of those carbon wheels, but at under $1,500, you would have quite a bit of money to upgrade that bike however you'd like, and I think that could be a pretty interesting option for some riders out there. It's also worth noting that the Bend is available as the V9X as well, which has a pretty similar part spec to this R9X, but instead of having a rigid carbon fiber fork, you get a Fox 32 step cast that gives you 40mm of travel instead. Lastly, as we always do, it's time to compare the Bend R9X to a few comparable bikes on the market, and that is the Canyon Grizzle CF SL7 ETAP and the Trek Checkpoint ALR 5 Axis. All of these bikes cost thereabouts of $3,000 and are dedicated gravel bikes, but each one brings something a little bit different to the table. Like the Bend R9X, the Checkpoint ALR 5 comes with an aluminum frame that is riddled with mounting points. It also gets a dropper post and a 1x electronic drivetrain, though the Trek does come with the lower end Apex group set as opposed to the Rival on the Polygon. Both bikes weigh about the same as well, despite the fact that the Trek comes with aluminum wheels as opposed to the carbon ones on the Bend. Where they really differ though is in the geometry, and the Trek has a much more aggressive riding position, akin to what you'd expect on a road bike. All in all, these are both great bikes, but for someone coming into the gravel scene from road biking or maybe wants a gravel bike that can double as a road bike, albeit if you put a front derailleur on there, then I would steer them more towards the Trek Checkpoint than the Bend. On the flip side though, riders looking for an adventure-focused bike or coming from the mountain bike scene would have a lot more fun, I think, on this Bend R9X. Let's move on though and see how this bike compares to the Canyon Grizzle, which sets itself apart with the addition of a carbon fiber frame, making it the lightest of the three bikes in our comparison. Like the R9X, it features SRAM's Rival group set, but swaps out the dropper post for Canyon's proprietary carbon fiber VCLS shock absorbing seat post. That said though, the Grizzle does come with internal routing for a dropper post, so you could throw one on there if you chose to. In terms of geometry, the Grizzle sits right about in the middle between the R9X and the Checkpoint ALR 5. All in all, the Grizzle is a great option for riders who prioritize a lightweight bike and don't care so much about the low seat tube and low slung frame that you'd get on the Bend. At the end of the day, the Polygon Bend R9X is a really cool bike, albeit with a slight caveat for riders like myself with longer legs who will probably want to replace that seat post pretty early on. The aggressive aluminum frame, carbon fiber wheels, and high quality group set make it a solid choice for riders looking to push the conventional limits of gravel riding. If you have any thoughts or questions on this bike, then you can go ahead and leave those in the comments, and I would love to have a conversation with you about it down there. And while you're there, if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and like this video, as well as subscribe to the 99 Spokes YouTube channel. And lastly, remember that bikes are for everyone. Have fun out there.